This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 10 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. If it hadn't been for the dead horse in the doorway, I wouldn't be here. I would have ridden out on my bay mare and taken my chances of escaping. But I couldn't ride out over that, for she would have jumped back and I would have got it in the head. We could have stayed in the house, but there wouldn't have been anything gained by that, for they would have starved us out. I thought it was better to come out and get a good square meal. Billy the Kid to the Las Vegas Gazette after his capture by Pat Garrett at Stinking Springs. On December 23, 1880, Pat Garrett and his posse had successfully captured Billy the Kid, Billy Wilson, Tom Pickett, and Dave Rudabaugh. The man wasn't even sheriff yet, and he'd already done what so many other lawmen, posses, and even the military had failed to do. He'd collared the young outlaw and former regulator William Bonney, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, and what remained of the Wilson gang. After their surrender, Garrett fed the men and then took them to the Wilcox Brazil Ranch, where they spent the night. One of the men of the posse, named Rudolph, would later say of the group, quote, "There was Billy, cheerful and chattering, excitement lighting up his face, Rudabaugh, also joyful and talkative, Tom Pickett, scared half to death, pondering his fate, and Billy Wilson, ashamed and uncommunicative." End quote. It appears even at this seemingly hopeless juncture that Billy the Kid knew he'd be free soon. After all, he'd escaped several close scrapes and from jail already. At least once. Maybe more if the myths and legends are to be believed. Although they don't hold much water. It don't matter, though. It doesn't matter what's fact or fiction in his past. He still had some real and true escapes up his sleeve. Before noon on Christmas Eve, December 24th, Garrett, Barney Mason, and the rest of the posse of lawmen rode into Fort Sumner with their prisoners in tow. Rudolph would later relate the sad meeting of Garrett and Charlie Beaudry's widow. Garrett was met by, quote, "a deranged, lamenting Mesilla Beaudry. She kicked and pummeled Garrett until she had to be pulled away." End quote. Her justified anger did not end there. Two of the Panhandle cattle lawmen carried Beaudry's body into the ex-hospital where they lived, and as they did so, Mesilla Beaudry struck one of them over the head with a branding iron. The man, quote, "had to drop Charlie at her feet. The poor woman was crazy with grief." End quote. Garrett then had the same man that would later bury Billy the Kid, Paco Anaya. Garrett paid him to bury Charlie Beaudry. Garrett then turned to Manuela and instructed her to buy Charlie a new suit for the funeral, and that she should charge the clothing to he, Pat Garrett. Mark Lee Gardner, into Hell on a Fast Horse, recounts that Billy the Kid wore a very distinctive sombrero-style hat, and when Charlie Beaudry had exited the old stone cabin at Stinking Springs, he had apparently been wearing Billy's sombrero. So when Pat Garrett gave the signal to shoot, he thought he was signing Billy's death warrant, not Charlie Beaudry's. I do not know if that's true, but it sure seems like Pat Garrett felt severe remorse for killing, quote-unquote, the wrong man. From the Beaudry's home, Garrett took the prisoners to the blacksmith, where they were all outfitted with irons. Garrett then took them to his old place of business, Beaver Smith's Saloon. While the posse and prisoners ate, Billy the Kid offered one of the possemen his rifle, but since Billy owed Beaver Smith, the saloon owner, so much money, Billy was forced to give the barkeep his Winchester instead. While they ate, the widow of the late Lucien Maxwell, the man who had turned Fort Sumner from a fort to a town, Miss Maxwell came into the saloon and asked Garrett if Billy the Kid could come over to her house where her daughter, Paulita, whom I have quoted from quite a bit in previous episodes, Miss Maxwell asked if Billy could come say goodbye to Paulita one last time. Rudabaugh and Billy had been shackled together over at the blacksmith shop, so the two, after Garrett allowed what he assumed was the final reunion to occur, the two outlaws shuffled over to the Maxwell residence for Billy's goodbye. Once inside, Miss Maxwell, maybe cleverly, maybe naively, asked the two lawmen, Hall and East, if maybe Billy could be unshackled for some private time with Paulita. Wink, wink. The men knew better and denied the request. East would later write, quote, "The lovers embraced, and she gave Billy one of those soul kisses the novelists tell us about. Till it being time to hit the trail for Vegas, we had to pull them apart, much against our wishes, for you know all the world loves a lover." End quote. Back outside in the cold December air, the four prisoners boarded a stagecoach that was to be driven by Brazil to Las Vegas. They had a 3-day journey ahead of them. They'd be spending a miserable Christmas imprisoned in a bumpy stagecoach. Before they left, though, in one of his many funny remarks, Billy the Kid gave Frank Stewart his pretty bay mare horse. Stewart had been the cattle detective who joined up with Pat Garrett, partly to get some action, partly to see justice, and partly because Pat Garrett had offered some of the $500 reward money. As Billy gave the horse to Stewart, the Kid dryly remarked, quote, he expected his business would be so confining for the next few months that he would hardly find time for horseback exercises. End quote. Charlie Beaudry would be buried on Christmas morning of 1880 in the cemetery next to Tom Folliard. As the outlaws and lawmen made their way to Las Vegas, that's what was going on. Again, Billy missed the burying of his friends. For Christmas dinner, Pat Garrett and his prisoners stopped at the home of, I'm not saying that again, Padre Polacco. Apparently it was a nice dinner, despite Billy the Kid having stolen 16 of the man's horses and possibly one of his revolvers. I still don't know if that really happened. Maybe the Polish ex-priest was still mad. Maybe he was still friendly with the young man he had once been on good terms with. Over the past few months and year or so, Billy the Kid seemed to have burned a lot of bridges after saddling up with the Wilson gang. It had been one bad decision after another in a life filled with them. Maybe he wasn't done with the bad decisions yet. After Padre Polacco's, the posse left the four residents, who were the last to have joined up. The cattlemen, too, left for White Oaks to help their fellow cattle lawmen. So it was now Brazil, Garrett, Mason, and possibly a few others. Pat Garrett remarked that Billy the Kid and Rudabaugh were, quote, cheerful and gay during the trip. Wilson seemed dejected and Pickett frightened. End quote. Billy the Kid and Rudabaugh are wanted for murder, essentially. Wilson for, I guess he did shoot the blacksmith in the back, but he's mostly wanted for counterfeiting. And Pickett just is in the wrong place at the wrong time. So two guys with the most to lose are the most cheerful. It's strange. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on December 26th, the residents of Las Vegas, New Mexico received a belated Christmas gift when the now, on account of the reward notice, infamous Billy the Kid showed up in their sleepy town. Once word reached that he was on his way, a crowd gathered to view the young outlaw. And he certainly delivered. The Las Vegas Gazette remarked that, quote, People stood on the muddy street corners and in hotel offices and saloons talking of the great event. End quote. Even the following day, the people were still lining up to see the 4 prisoners, especially Billy the Kid. In the morning of the 27th, the sheriff of San Miguel County, Desiderio Romero, allowed an old Pecos friend to deliver some clothing to the outlaws. The man wanted to, quote-unquote, see them go out in style. The Gazette wrote of the event, quote, the doors at the entrance stood open. A large crowd strained their necks to get a glimpse of the prisoners, who stood in the passageway like children waiting for a Christmas tree distribution. End quote. With clothes in hand, Pat Garrett took the prisoners to the blacksmith to have their shackles removed. They then put on their fresh suits before the blacksmith began to reshackle them. This time, the 2 Billies were shackled together. Rudabaugh was shackled alone, and Tom Pickett, well, he didn't have an arrest warrant, so he was going to stay put in the Las Vegas jail until one could be found for him. Not for murder, but for cattle theft. While the shackles were being replaced, though, a reporter entered the blacksmith shop and was allowed to interview the prisoners. Billy the Kid was still as happy and light as he had been after being arrested. When a reporter said to Billy, "You appear to take it easy," Billy responded with, quote, "Yes, what's the use of looking on the gloomy side of everything? The laugh's on me this time." End quote. Billy then looked around the crowd and asked, "Is the jail at Santa Fe any better than this one? This is a terrible place to put a fellow in." End quote. Billy apparently asked this of everyone who dared to speak to him, and the answer was always the same. No, sir, it is not better. To this, Billy said something to the effect of, "Oh well, guess I gotta put up with what I had to." The Las Vegas Gazette further remarked that Billy was, quote, "the attraction of the show," and as he stood there, lightly kicking the toes of his boots on the stone pavement to keep his feet warm, one would scarcely mistrust that he was the hero of 40 Thieves romance, which this paper had been running in serial form for 6 weeks or more. End quote. And make no mistake, despite his circumstances, Billy the Kid was loving it. The paper remarked that he said, quote, "There was a big crowd gazing at me, wasn't there? Well, perhaps some of them will think me half a man now. Everyone seems to think I was some kind of an animal." End quote. The paper also commented on his appearance. They said, "He did look human, indeed, but there was nothing very mannish about him in appearance, for he looked and acted a mere boy. He is about 5 feet, 8 or 9 inches tall, slightly built and lithe, weighing about 140, a frank and open countenance, looking like a schoolboy, with the traditional silky fuzz on his upper lip, clear blue eyes, with a roguish snap about them, light hair and complexion. He is, in all, quite a handsome-looking fellow, the only imperfection being 2 prominent front teeth, slightly protruding like squirrel's teeth, and he has agreeable and winning ways." End quote. Again, from what I gather in all my reading, Billy the Kid was nice, fun, charming, kind of handsome, but kind of goofy looking on account of them teeth. Everyone who met him loved him. Well, almost everyone. And it's a shame he never could act right, at least since McSween's death. He was, by now, no longer the regulator he once was, but he was still dangerous, and as you'll hear soon enough, he was still deadly. Later that night, on the 27th, when he read the paper, Billy got a little sad when they pointed out that Billy the Kid had called his friends cowards. He was quoted as saying, "I never said any such thing. I know they ain't cowards." And neither was Billy the Kid. His associates, though, were not having the same fun that Billy was. Billy Wilson was remarked as looking, quote, glum and sober, but from underneath his broad-brimmed hat, we saw a face that had a by no means bad look. He is light-complexioned, light hair, bluish-gray eyes, is a little stouter than Bonnie, and far quieter. He appeared ashamed and in not very good spirits. End quote. Meanwhile, Rudabaugh was remarked as being a mean-looking SOB. One of the people who had seen him the previous day said he was, quote, a fierce-looking, dark-bearded man who kept his slouch hat pulled well down over his eyes and who looked neither to the right nor to the left, end quote. Unlike the kid, neither Billy Wilson nor Dave Rudabaugh were confident in their ability to escape whatever was coming next. Eventually, Pat Garrett headed to the jail to take his 3 prisoners to Santa Fe. They were heading that way via rail. The only hiccup was that the county sheriff there, Romero, was not about to let the man who murdered his jailer out of his sight. If you'll recall, when I introduced Dave Rudabaugh, I said he shot a man in Las Vegas while trying to free his comrades from jail. The sheriff of San Miguel County had not forgotten that the man he killed was the town jailer. But after some back and forth, Pat Garrett's deputy U.S. Marshal star outranked the sheriff's. Not to mention, Garrett had promised Rudabaugh that he'd safely get the prisoner to Santa Fe. And if Pat allowed the sheriff and his deputies to get a hold of the man, there was no doubt that they'd lynch Rudabaugh right there in the street. From the jail, they were taken to the train platform where they boarded and were sat down within the car. This is when it got interesting, though. By now, the Sheriff Romero had gathered a crowd, an angry crowd, and they were hell-bent on taking Rudabaugh. It really seemed like a confrontation was about to take place between the deputy U.S. Marshal with his posse and the sheriff and his posse. Garrett apparently told the passengers in the car, quote, any of you people who don't want to be in it had better get out before I lock the car, as we are liable to have a hell of a fight in a few minutes, end quote. Many of the passengers fled. They took that opportunity, but some stayed put, and they even pulled out their own weapons. At the same time, a group of Hispanics who were with the sheriff's posse confronted the train's engineer to stop the train from leaving. One of the men said to the engineer, quote, my father does not want this train to pull out of here, end quote. The engineer, Dan Daly, responded with, who's your father? This man shouted, Sheriff Romero is my father. Dan Daly, the engineer, did not take the threat seriously, and he proceeded to let off some steam, at which point this man said, I don't want to shed any blood, but if you try to pull out, you will be a dead man. With that, Dan Daly relented. The train would not be leaving on time. Despite the possible shootout, which could erupt at any moment, one of the reporters for the Las Vegas Gazette approached the window where Billy the Kid was sitting and began to strike up a conversation with the young outlaw. Billy would say to the reporter, quote, I don't blame you for writing of me as you have. You had to believe others' stories, but then I don't know as anyone would believe anything good of me anyway. I wasn't the leader of any gang. I was for Billy the whole time. I found that there were certain men who wouldn't let me live in the country, and so I was going to leave. We had all our grub in the house when they took us in, and we were going to a place about 6 miles away in the morning to cook it and then lie it out. I haven't stolen any stock. I made my living by gambling, but that was the only way I could live. They wouldn't let me settle down. If they had, I wouldn't be here today. End quote. Now, while a lot of that may be true, he was never leader of a gang, that's true. He did make his living by gambling, that's true, but he was indeed a cattle thief. He may deny it to the newspaper man, but history tells a different story. Billy then turned his attention after this interview to the seemingly impending violence when he said, quote, if I only had my Winchester, I'd lick the whole crowd, end quote. Garrett had returned to the platform as Sheriff Romero's brother, also a deputy, and 5 other armed men approached the sheriff-elect of Lincoln County. When they got right on up to Pat, one of the men, pistol in hand, said, let's go right in and take him out of there, meaning Rudabaugh, who by now was visibly shaken. Pat Garrett coolly responded to the man, come and take him. It seemed, from all people there that moment, that Garrett was as cool as a cucumber, even as the men began to board the train. But Garrett was having none of it, and he later recalled that at this time, as the deputy Romero and his posse were about to board the train, Garrett said he simply, quote, requested them, in my mildest tones, to get down, and they slid to the ground like a covey of hardback turtles off the banks of the Pecos, end quote. But what really happened, according to one of Garrett's men, a man named Jim East, was that Garrett shoved a revolver in Romero's stomach and pushed the lot of them off the train's stairs. Garrett then turned back to the passengers who remained, and he looked at his men and then the outlaws before saying if it came to it, he was going to arm the lot of them to, quote, let them take a hand, end quote. Billy the Kid excitedly declared, all right, Pat, all I want is a 6-shooter. There is no danger, though. Those fellows won't fight. And he was right. But most people there were of a different opinion in that moment. This whole standoff at the tracks lasted an incredible 45 minutes. But eventually, a man in the crowd spoke up about how this wasn't the way to go about this sort of thing, and soon after, another man from the crowd, the postal inspector, J. Fred Morley, came up to Garrett, and he told him he knew how to engineer a train, and, quote, if you will let me, I'll slip down through the mob, get in the cab, pull the throttle open, and we'll get out of here, end quote. Garrett responded with, good, go do it. And do it he did. Morley opened up that train's throttle so wide that the whole steel beast spun its wheels before catching, and the whole train jerked forward. Garrett's man, Jimmy, said, quote, by the time we got to the end of the siding, it seemed like we were going a mile a minute, and the Mexicans stood there with their mouths open, end quote. The sheriff's son had no choice but to release the engineer, who caught up to the speeding train, jumped aboard, and off they went towards Santa Fe. As the train sped away, though, Billy was said to have leaned out his window, and according to the Las Vegas Gazette, he took off his hat and, quote, invited us to call and see him in Santa Fe, calling out, adios, end quote. The train made it all the way to Glorieta Pass, where the Gettysburg of the West took place at the base of the Sangre de Cristos over 18 years prior. At the top of the pass, the train stalled, and Garrett let his prisoners out. Apparently, there was a good amount of whiskey in the train car, and most of the men that day partook of it. This entire time, aboard the train car was a man from New York who went out west for a little vacation of sorts. Well, obviously, it was a trip he'd never forget. He did just witness the near violent standoff. He got to meet murderers and thieves and Billy the Kid. It had certainly been an exciting day for this man from New York named Miller. He thankfully recorded all of this, and he gave a good description of the Kid as he was at the close of 1880. Miller wrote of the Kid, quote, his costume was quite on the Mexican order, his language much the same. His curly brown locks and handsome face would have attracted attention anywhere. And, while looking at him and listening to his conversation, it was difficult to believe that I was in the presence of such a red-handed murderer. End quote. By the time the train reached Santa Fe, word of his capture, his appearance, and his mythical tale was already reaching newspapers across the continent. Most of what was printed was absolutely made up, or as George R. Matthews, the author, puts it, poppycock. But I did like the Illustrated Police News out of Boston when they called Billy the Kid, Boy Chief of New Mexico Outlaws and Cattle Thieves. That publication actually ran his tintype picture a few weeks later. Once in Santa Fe on December 27th, Sheriff-elect and Deputy U.S. Marshal Pat Garrett turned over the 3 prisoners to fellow Deputy U.S. Marshal Charles Conklin, who promptly escorted the 3 to their jail. Pat Garrett, feeling his job was done, returned to Lincoln, probably hoping to never see the Kid again. As word continued to spread throughout the nation, on January 1st, 1881, Billy the Kid would write to the governor, whose office was only 2 blocks away, and in the note, Billy the Kid wrote, quote, Dear Sir, I would like to see you for a few moments if you can spare time. Yours respect, W.H. Bonney. Billy was still desperately hoping for that pardon the governor had promised him. The governor was out of town and in the nation's capital, but upon his return to Santa Fe, the governor promptly ignored the message. The governor, by now, had washed his hands of the kid and was glad to have it all in the rear-view mirror. Or so he thought. I would now like to read an extended passage from George R. Matthews' Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend. In this passage, he quotes from a newspaper that ran at the time. On or about January 17, a Las Vegas Gazette reporter went to Santa Fe to interview the 3 prisoners. The January 20 issue reported, a few days ago, a representative of the Gazette paid a visit to Billy Bonney, the Kid, Dave Rudabaugh, and Billy Wilson in the Santa Fe jail. They were all heavily shackled and were lying about on their cots, but rose as the heavy iron door swung back on its hinges. They all appeared to be in good humor. When the reporter made some remarks on the tidiness of the dirt floor cell, "Oh, this is a palace as compared with that place they put fellas in Las Vegas," then, glancing around and contemplating their work, said, "We've been scrubbing up today." In fact, Bonney, Wilson, and Rudabaugh had begun to dig a tunnel under the adobe brick wall and had been scrubbing up to prevent discovery of their escape plan. As the conversation continued, Bonney remarked, "I'm getting up a terrible reputation," referring to an article he had read in the January 8 issue of the Illustrated Police News. "I got hold of the paper first when it was brought in," Bonney said, "but I was ashamed to let the other fellas see it." The cover illustration showed a brawny, mustachioed Bonney chopping at a log with a large axe, while a woman kneels by his side, warding off the pursuing enemies with her determined expression. The caption read, "Bill Bonney, the Kid, and his last daring escape. A 25-year-old desperado who is the terror of the Southwest, shielded from bullets by his woman, while he escapes his pursuers by destroying a bridge over a canyon." The police news cover has been the laughingstock of Santa Fe, reported the Gazette, and Billy made all manner of fun of it. The article stated that Bonney has been accompanied frequently by a woman, a young Mexican girl, who on more than one occasion has rendered him service. A few weeks ago, when Bonney was hard-pressed in the mountains, she stood between him and his pursuers while he cut away a bridge. I, Bonney, told the Gazette reporter I never had any beautiful Mexican girl with me. It was as much as I could do to take care of myself. But his eyes flashing as he spoke, "She was game, though. See the way she stood off the crowd after me?" said the admirer of personal courage. As the interview ended, the reporter asked, "Well, Billy, what do you think of your notoriety?" "I don't see any money in it," replied Billy. "Everything that has been done in that country is laid to me." And he really seemed ashamed of the reputation that he had gained. The newsman suggested, "If you got out, you could get up a show like Buffalo Bill. You have had advertising enough." "If" was his only comment. End all quotes. On February 28th, that escape plan mentioned earlier was finally discovered by the sheriff and a deputy U.S. Marshal. The 3 men in the cell had almost dug a tunnel to the streets of Santa Fe, and they would have gotten away with it in only a few more nights. The fact that their pillows and mattresses were all filled with rocks and dirt, that's what seems to have been what gave them away. They were apparently running out of places to hide the earth they were removing. With that plan foiled, Billy the Kid wrote to the governor yet again on March 2nd. He wrote, quote, "Dear Sir, I wish you would come down to the jail and see me. It will be to your interest to come and see me. I have some letters which date back 2 years, and there are parties very anxious to get them, but I will not dispose of them until I see you. That is, if you will come immediately. End quote. His plan by now was to blackmail the governor into finally issuing Billy's pardon. He figured he could publish the letter the governor had written him for all to see. Maybe the public would side with the young outlaw. The governor, though, ignored the letter. Undeterred, Billy wrote him yet again a few days later. Quote, "Dear Sir, I wrote you a little note the day before yesterday, but have received no answer. I expect you have forgotten what you promised me this month 2 years ago, but I have not, and I think you had ought to have come and seen me as I have requested you to. I have done everything that I promised you I would, and you have done nothing that you promised me. I think when you think the matter over, you will come down and see me, as I can explain everything to you. Judge Leonard passed through here on his way east in January and promised to come and see me on his way back, but he did not fulfill his promise. It looks to me like I am getting left in the cold. I am not treated right by U.S. Marshal Sherman. He lets every stranger that comes to see me through curiosity in to see me, but will not let a single one of my friends in, not even an attorney. I guess they mean to send me up without giving me any show, but they will have a nice time doing it. I am not entirely without friends. I shall expect to see you sometime today. Patiently waiting, I am very truly yours. Respect. W.M. H. Bonney." End quote. The governor, of course, ignored him. As Matthews points out, it was too late anyway. The whole country knew how bloodthirsty and evil Billy Bonney the Kid was. Or at least that's what the media they consumed told them. And everyone believed the media that they consumed. Now, thankfully, that's not how Americans are now, like today, believing everything the media says. But if the governor did pardon him now, he'd be in pretty hot water with a nation bent on taming the West. Realizing he was going to need some legal help, Bonney tried to hire an attorney, the same attorney that was representing Rudabaugh for Rudabaugh's alleged murder over in Las Vegas. Problem was, Billy had no money. He offered his really nice mare, but he'd already given that horse to the Frank Stewart of the Texas Panhandle Cattlemen's Association posse, although Billy would try to deny he ever did such a thing. They did track down the horse, who had been given as a gift, and the new owner refused to just give it away. The horse was, after all, described as being, quote, "one of the best, if not the best animal in the territory," end quote. So Bonney had no defense attorney, which meant one would be appointed to him. And that didn't exactly instill a lot of hope in Bonney the Kid. But some luck did change for Billy the Kid after he wrote the governor one final letter. He wrote, quote, "Dear Sir, for the last time I ask, will you keep your promise? I start below, south to La Mesilla, tomorrow. Send answer by bearer," end quote. The following day, on March 28th, after 3 months in jail at Santa Fe, Ira Leonard, who took over for the murdered Chapman, who had been working for Miss McSween, and who also didn't like Reinerson, Ira Leonard would part way accompany the kid to Mesilla. Now, no one knows why Ira Leonard showed up to defend the kid, but Matthews suggests, the author, he suggests it was probably at the behest of the governor, who, while not able or willing to pardon the outlaw, was apparently wanting to help him in some small way. Later that day, the two Billies, Wilson and the kid, they were secretly taken out of jail and put on a train to Mesilla, the once Confederate capital of Arizona. Bob Olinger despite what other sources said when I read them, did not in fact accompany the outlaws southward. They were, however, accompanied by Deputy U.S. Marshal Tony Nyes and Santa Fe Chief of Police Frank Chavez. The ride south was uneventful, at least until the train reached the end of the line, 40 miles north of Mesilla. Once the train stopped there, a lynch mob greeted the two lawmen and their two outlaws. Seeing the tense situation, the two lawmen brandished their weapons as the four of them stepped off the train. When one man in the crowd shouted, "Let's get them fellas," Nyes turned to the crowd and responded with, quote, "You don't get them without somebody being killed." End quote. After that awesome reply, the crowd allowed the four to continue on their way. In Las Cruces, the stage they were on stopped, and by now Ira Leonard was there with the four of them. So it was the two Billies, Ira Leonard, the judge and attorney, the deputy U.S. Marshal, and the chief of Santa Fe Police. When someone yelled from a crowd that had gathered at Las Cruces, "Which one of you is Billy the Kid?" William Bonney placed his hand upon Ira Leonard's shoulder and said, quote, "This is the man," end quote. Sense of humor until the very end. Although it is not, in fact, Billy's end. Not for a while, anyways. In Mesilla, the two Billies were given over to another sheriff and placed in the county jail with 14 other outlaws. After only one night in jail, Billy the Kid was sent to see the corrupt Judge Bristol on March 30th, 1881. The following day, Billy was back in court, where he pled not guilty in the case. And that case is United States of America versus Charles Beaudry, Doc Scurlock, Henry Brown, Henry Antrim, alias Kid, John Middleton, Stephen Stevens, John Scroggins, George Coe, and Frederick Waite. He was the only defendant to ever see court. His trial was set for April 5th. This trial was actually for the murder of Andrew Roberts at Blazer's Mill. That's the shootout that saw Dick Brewer killed by Roberts with his great shot. Well, Ira Leonard withdrew Billy's not guilty plea and argued that since Blazer's Mill is on Indian land, the government can't bring a case against the kid. And surprisingly, especially to myself, the corrupt Judge Bristol agreed, and he dismissed the case. But the kid was still going to be tried for the murder of the corrupt Sheriff William Brady and his deputy Hindman. Almost everyone was okay with this, though, because now the federal government didn't have to waste any money, and there was no doubt that he'd be convicted for the sheriff's murder, which would result in him hanging and the territory being rid of yet another troublesome outlaw. A few newspapers at the time were mad at the dismissal, but they were being short-sighted, as journalism is usually. This dismissal, though, meant that the surviving regulators who had quit the territory, like Doc Scurlock and George Coe, they were free men. A few other of the former regulators could still be tried for the sheriff's murder, like Middleton, Brown, and Waite, but they would never return to New Mexico for the rest of their lives. Billy the Kid was the only one who had survived and who had not fled. And here he was, about to be hanged on account of the regulators' pursuit of striking blows in the defense of justice. On April 8, 1881, the trial for the murder of the corrupt Sheriff Brady began. The court clerk, George Bowman, wrote that the courtroom was, quote, crowded with a motley array of spectators, end quote. But he continues. And there, sitting a little to one side of the judge's desk, was Billy the Kid. He would also write that Billy looked like a rather pleasant-looking young man with, quote, wavy hair, dark eyes, sullen and defiant. Now, there was a mark of a keen intellect in that forehead and the clean-cut sweep of the jaw. But there was a mark of brutishness in his face, too, a coarseness stamped across his features. It looked almost ridiculous. All those armed men sitting around a harmless-looking youth with the down still on his chin. As a further precaution, Billy the Kid was kept handcuffed during the trial. He was a dangerous man, and the court was taking no chances. End quote. For whatever reason, Ira Leonard was no longer Billy's defense attorney, and instead the local Mesilla attorneys John Bale and Albert Fountain were to defend Billy the Kid. I've talked about Albert Fountain before. He was the Mesilla independent newspaperman who had written about the boys and the cattle rustling and the lawlessness. I talked about him in the first couple of episodes, and I will talk about him later as well. John Bale, though, he was a man from Illinois who studied law with none other than Abraham Lincoln. Both men, both these attorneys, were ardent defenders of justice as they saw it and seekers of punishment for those who broke the law. Thankfully, William Reinerson, the corrupt DA that was involved in the Santa Fe ring, he no longer held that office. But it wouldn't do Billy a lot of good or any good. Reinerson had been replaced by Simon Newcomb. Now, I wish I could cite for y'all the courtroom drama and speeches and objections, but the transcript of the trial has been lost to history. We do know Billy Matthews, the deputy sheriff under Brady, he was there as a witness. And we do know Sam Corbett, ex-regulator partisan, he showed up to the trial for Billy the Kid, although he wasn't interviewed as a witness. He was just moral support, really. Now I'll let Matthews tell you what happened at the trial, since there's not really anything I can quote from directly. Matthews does use direct courtroom quotes, and he cites them, but they are from books written a few decades after the trial. Maybe the courtroom documents were around when these men wrote their books. They just no longer exist now. It's a long passage, but it's good. Author Matthews wrote, quote, while witness testimony does not survive, Matthews, he means Billy Matthews, the deputy, Matthews no doubt testified that as Brady's deputy had been walking with Brady when a volley of gunshots from behind a wall struck and killed the sheriff and fellow deputy George Heineman, and that he saw Bonnie run into the street and take the Winchester rifle that lay next to the sheriff's body. Surprisingly, George Pepin, another Brady deputy, walking with the sheriff that day, did not testify. Apparently there were no defense witnesses, and Billy declined to testify on his own behalf. The trial lasted only 2 days, April 8th and April 9th. On the second day, after the prosecuting witnesses finished their testimony, Fountain requested that Judge Bristol give the following instructions to the jury. If the jury are satisfied from the evidence to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt that the defendant was present at the time of the firing of the shot or shots that caused the death of the deceased Brady, yet before they will be justified in finding the defendant guilty, they must be further satisfied from the evidence and the evidence alone, to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt, that the defendant either fired the shots that killed the deceased or some of them, or assisted the parties who fired the same either by his advice, encouragement, or procurement or command from a premeditated design to effect the death of Brady. If the jury entertain any reasonable doubt upon any of these points, they must find a verdict of acquittal. In short, Fountain argued the jury could render a guilty verdict only if the evidence presented proved that Billy had fired the shot or commanded others to fire the shots that killed Brady. Known as the noose or loose argument, it was a sound defense strategy, and in the absence of any actual evidence that Billy fired the fatal shot, offered a reasonable expectation of acquittal. But Judge Bristol, intent on conviction, rejected Fountain's requested jury instructions. Instead, Bristol told the jury if he was present encouraging, inciting, aiding in, abetting, advising, or commanding this killing of Brady, he is as much guilty as though he fired the fatal shot. As to what would or would not be a reasonable doubt of guilt, I charge you that belief in the guilt of this defendant to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt does not require you to so believe absolutely and to a mathematical certainty, that is, to justify a verdict of guilty. It is not necessary for you to be as certain that this defendant is guilty as you are that 2 and 2 are 4, or that 2 and 3 are 5. Merely a vague conjecture or a bare possibility that the defendant may be innocent is not sufficient to cause a reasonable doubt of his guilt. So instructed, the 12 jurors, and then Matthews names all 12 jurors. The 12 jurors, accompanied by 2 sworn officers, retired to deliberate on their verdict. Not surprisingly, after due deliberation, the said jury returned into court and upon their oaths found as follows, quote, "We, the jury, do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree and do assess his punishment at death." End quote. After the jury foreman's pronouncement, Judge Bristol set Wednesday, April 13th as the kid's sentencing date and had Billy returned to his cell. End all quotes. So the corrupt Judge Bristol interjected his 2 cents, and the jury agreed with him. Regulators strike blows in defense of justice. But justice is in the hands of those who wield power. The regulators were by this time either dead or they had fled. They were no more. Justice was now in the hands of the almighty Santa Fe ring, and by extension the long arm of the law that was and is the United States of America. Billy would find no reprieve for his actions, which he undertook in defense of right and justice from a courtroom led by a man who only knew justice when it filled his pockets. The sole remaining regulator was to be put to death. A jury of his peers said so, after all. 4 days later, Billy reappeared in Judge Bristol's courtroom, where the judge had this to say to the kid. The defendant should be confined in prison by the sheriff of said county. So that would be Lincoln County, and the sheriff would be Pat Garrett. The defendant should be confined in prison by the sheriff of said county until Friday the 13th day of May, when between the hours of 9 of the clock in the forenoon and 3 of the clock in the afternoon, he, the said William Bonney, alias Kid, be hanged by the neck until his body be dead. End quote. So Billy the Kid was to be taken back to Lincoln County, kept in jail, and then hanged on Friday the 13th in the streets of Lincoln. It was said his gallows should be constructed on the spot where the sheriff and his deputy were killed. After the trial, the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican wrote, quote, "Billy the Kid, who was convicted of murder in the first degree at the La Mesilla court, is said to be weakening. His spirit has been broken, and he finds that he is not likely to escape so easily this time as heretofore. When the kid's execution comes off, it will probably attract more people than any similar event that ever occurred in the territory. Certainly, this consideration ought to flatter and console the young gentleman." End quote. The paper was being sensational as usual. The kid's spirit was not weakened, and more importantly, he had indeed not found his resolve to escape broken. For he will not hang on Friday the 13th in May of 1881. He will, in fact, escape, and his escape will be legendary and deadly. A couple days after the trial, a newspaperman named Mr. Bond from the Mesilla News interviewed Billy the Kid. During the interview, Mr. Bond asked, "Why on earth didn't you, William Bonney, defend yourself on the stand?" Billy replied, according to Mr. Bond, with, quote, "Well, I had intended at one time not to say a word in my own behalf because persons would say, 'Oh, he lied. Newman, editor of the Semi-Weekly, gave me a rough deal. He created prejudice against me and is trying to incite a mob to lynch me. He sent me a paper which showed it. I think it a dirty mean advantage to take of me, considering my situation and knowing I could not defend myself by word or act. But I suppose he thought he would give me a kick downhill. Newman came to see me the other day. I refused to talk to him or tell him anything. But I believe the News is always willing to give its readers both sides of a question. If mob law is going to rule, better dismiss judge and sheriff and let all take chances alike. I expect to be lynched in going to Lincoln. Advise persons never to engage in killing." End quote. If I had to name this series, it would be Advise Persons Never to Engage in Killing, which is the name of this episode. Mr. Bond would then ask Billy if he thought the governor would finally issue that pardon he was rightfully owed, and promised. Billy said, quote, "Considering the active part Governor Wallace took on our side and the friendly relations that existed between him and me and the promise he made, I think he ought to pardon me. Don't know that he will do it. When I was arrested for that murder, Sheriff Brady, he let me out and gave me the freedom of the town and let me go about with my arms. When I got ready to leave Lincoln in June 1879, I left. I think it hard that I should be the only one to suffer the extreme penalty of the law." End quote. I, of course, agree. It is a shame that the young man, who was the only one to attend court back in Lincoln, therefore he was the only one who the law came down on. It's a shame he was forced to face the brunt of the law by himself. And now he'd been sentenced to death for killing a corrupt sheriff who did everything in his power to destroy Tunstall and McSween on behalf of his, Brady's, benefactors. And these benefactors were themselves entirely corrupt and heartless. By now you know I am not an impartial history podcaster. I have my leanings and beliefs and prejudices. My favorite review of my own show is one in which some anonymous woman wrote, quote, "Thomas Wayne Riley is the reason I would rather meet a bear than a man when I'm in the back country camping in a national park." End quote. But y'all are still here, and I'm thankful for that. I choose to lean into my convictions instead of shying away from them, and I'm completely subjective when I tell a story. I'd rather y'all hear my passion than just learn the base facts. Although I don't distort the facts to fit my perspective, I promise y'all that. What I am about to tell y'all, it seems relevant. And this story of mine occurred in late 2012. One of my best friends, I thankfully have many best friends, but my best friend at the time and I were roommates, and we owned a business throughout that year. This was in Oklahoma City. My friend and I owned a company that cleaned carpets, detailed cars, and cleaned foreclosed homes for the Bank of America. We were called Mr. Echo Enterprises after my late dog, Echo. Once autumn rolled around, our business dried up, and then we became flat broke. We couldn't pay utilities for the house we were renting from my father, who was at that time in Wisconsin. We were often hungry, yet, we could still afford the basic necessities. Such are the priorities of young unmarried men with a zest for adventure and no concept of the future. By December of that year, 2012, the powers that be had shut off our electricity and eventually our water. The electricity was fine, we could cook and live without it, but the water was a problem. Thankfully, we had the tools and the know-how to go and turn that water right back on once the truck left after they'd shut it off. Eventually, though, the water company wised up and just took the entire on-off switch of our water completely away from our hands. Therefore, no more water. No electricity. It was getting cold, we were hungry, and we were desperate. Our 20-something-year-old undeveloped brains thought it would be a good idea, or rather it was the only idea. We decided we needed to rob the Bank of America in downtown Oklahoma City. We planned the entire thing down to every single detail. I say we. Unfortunately, it was mostly me. The robbery was going to take place on the Friday before Christmas. The bank had been robbed twice in the last year, and no one had gotten caught, so we liked our odds. The morning of the robbery, though, my father called me. He asked how I was doing. I said, great. He asked if everything was okay. I said, of course. He then told me he had an overwhelming feeling that morning. He said the Holy Ghost told him that he should call me. A few days later, my entire truck was packed up. And I moved in with my parents in Wisconsin. I was 25 years old, living with my parents again, but at least I hadn't robbed a bank in downtown Oklahoma City. So I can sympathize with a young man who doesn't have a father that calls him the morning that they decide to steal a bunch of cattle or horses. I have sympathy for a young man who was forced to kill at a young age and then found himself in situation after situation where his friends were hunted down and killed. Billy the Kid will, on account of his survival instinct, be forced to make terrible and deadly decisions. Of course, he should not have made any of the decisions that led up to this moment, and he should have taken his medicine when it was sent down to him by the courts. But he's young and dumb and full of life. He also feels like he's gotten the short end of the stick. The pardon he was promised was never delivered. And he's watched his friends die and his adopted families be chased off or worse. Billy the Kid isn't like the average a-hole who kills, robs, steals, rapes, destroys the world around him just to watch it burn. Maybe that's why I can sympathize with him. I have a son now, and an incredible wife. She married me regardless of me being a dummy when I was young and almost robbing a bank, and yes, she knows this story. Like my father did with me, I'm going to make sure my son never has to go outside of the law to live his life. In the same way my father saved me, my only goal is to save my son from having to make the decisions Billy the Kid made, or I almost made. And I will make sure he won't have to make the decisions Billy the Kid will continue to make as this historical tale goes on. What's going to play out with the remainder of this story is violent and unfortunate. Men will lose their lives, including William H. Bonney the Kid. One man he will kill was with the house and against McSween, particularly on the day of the big kill. And you bet against the house you lose. Billy, like Tunstall, McSween, and countless other men, William H. Bonney will soon find that out. But even if you're with the house, you may not win big, as Brady and Heineman and one of the jailers who will guard Billy and Lincoln is soon to discover. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande. Tracked a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down. Killed the rancher's daughter, was gone without a sound. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls. The ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.